Our scripture reading for today is taken from the Gospel according to St. John, the 19th chapter, beginning with verse 28. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I thirst." A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. Today, we will be visiting with Morton Kelsey's imaginary character, Baruch the priest. It's hard for us to imagine that the group responsible for Jesus' crucifixion was the priesthood of the great temple in Jerusalem. These priests, the top religious leaders of their day, sought out Judas and bribed him to identify Jesus to the temple guard. Then they put pressure on Pontius Pilate and incited a mob to convict Jesus and have him crucified. Remember, these priests had been intimidated by the Roman Empire for almost 100 years. They'd been forced to compromise so long that the younger priests took compromise as a normal way of doing things. These priests were, after all, the civil and religious leaders of their people. And so they became very powerful, and power corrupts. Their own wealth and position were threatened by Jesus' radical teachings. These priests had convinced themselves, as we so often do, that Jesus was disturbing the status quo. They felt they were serving the cause of God to have Jesus executed. Well, Baruch was one of the younger priests who set out from the temple to witness the crucifixion. The group arrived at Golgotha just as the three doomed men appeared bearing their crosses. Baruch enjoyed the comfort and prestige of his office. He had been infuriated when he heard the reports that this young visionary, Jesus, was presuming to cleanse the temple and speak out against their priestly heritage. Baruch himself had to confess. At times in his inner thoughts, he secretly wondered if there might not be some truth to Jesus' critique. And yet, this revolutionary Jesus was going about it the wrong way. He was trying to turn everything upside down overnight. As Jesus was being lifted to the cross, one of Baruch's fellow priests cried out, "Hey you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself, come down from that cross." Another priest chimed in, "Hey, you saved others, can't you save yourself? Let you, Christ, King of Israel, come down from that cross." Baruch was embarrassed, indignant with the reaction of his fellow priests. Perhaps this one must be crucified, but need his fellow priests ridicule and make fun of him in the process? Baruch marveled at the cruelty of his colleagues. You see, Baruch himself had once been left to die in the desert. He knew human cruelty, so he didn't ridicule Jesus like the others. Instead, he watched and listened. He saw that Jesus' appearance was far different than he'd been led to believe. Jesus had real dignity, genuine courage. He neither cried out nor cursed like the others. His words were few. He spoke of forgiveness, paradise, love, even as he hung dying on that cross. This incredible attitude of faith, love, and peace had a profound impact on Baruch. And then he heard these words of physical anguish. "I thirst." These words, "I thirst," caused Baruch to have a flashback of a time 4 years earlier. He'd been in the country beyond the Jordan River. His party was set upon by thieves. All had been killed except him, and he had been beaten and left for dead in the hot, burning sand of the desert. Hours had passed. His body became dehydrated. He ached for a drink. He had experienced traumatic thirst, and his agony was unquenchable. It was only fate that he was rescued by another caravan. So Baruch understood the unbearable suffering that Jesus endured when he spoke the words, "I thirst." Baruch ran, picked up a javelin, put a sponge on it, and poured cool, sour wine into it. He held it up. Jesus drank and looked at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. Jesus' cry had elicited Baruch's spontaneous act of compassion. Jesus' suffering struck a chord in Baruch's own inner being. His sudden response out of the depths of his own human pain opened to him a new level of understanding. Baruch stood there trying to understand what had just happened. He remained after they took the bodies down and carried them away. He saw the others standing there. They too had received Jesus' words, and their lives were changed. Together they shared their sorrow and found compassion. They became living testimony that compassion is suffering mutually shared. Morton Kelsey's imaginary character, Baruch the priest, invites us to consider how human suffering can lead to compassion. Karen Armstrong, a historian of religion, believes that the real meaning of Jesus' suffering on the cross was to evoke compassion in us. She says, when we look at the crucifix, when we look at Christ's suffering and pain, we feel a flood of compassion, and it is this compassion that saves us. Jesus' suffering on the cross. The physical thirst, the physical pain evoke compassion in us. And it's this compassion that brings us into communion with one another and into communion with God. So the question that Baruch the priest and I leave with you is this: how has another person's suffering and pain evoked compassion in you? And how has this compassion brought you into the presence of God? Have a blessed day.